Reading 9, Drawing Down Greenhouse Gases by Being the Change. You may have wondered why I included Peter Kalmus twice in this course. First in the documentary on Being the Change, and now in the book of the same title, upon which the film is obviously based. In fact, I imagine this week's reading to be more akin to Project Drawdown than the documentary on Kalmus. Project Drawdown gave us a glimpse of the big picture, what we need to do globally to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. However, as someone in our class aptly noted, and I'm quoting here, most of the solutions are not things that I can do personally right now. I cannot switch to wind power, solar power, or nuclear power when I am currently living on campus. I also cannot implement agricultural practices or improve my rice cultivation methods. Well said. In contrast, Peter Kalmus looks at what each of us can do to draw down our own greenhouse gas emissions, things like bike and eat with the climate in mind. True, we've been discussing these things for a number of weeks now, but not through the eyes of a scientist. As a climate scientist, Kalmus is able to do the same sort of calculations that we saw in Project Drawdown, but in his case, he focuses on the issue in a far more personal way. For example, he notes that when he went vegetarian in 2012, it reduced his greenhouse gas emissions by 1,500 kilograms of CO2 per year. Going vegan reduced his emissions by 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent gases per year. As he notes, Kalmus's vegetarian veganism hence reduced his emissions by 400 kilograms per year, which in America is 0.4 metric tons. He also began growing food and trading surpluses with neighbors. Presumably, that then makes this number even lower. What is interesting here is that Kalmus is not just calculating what sort of emissions are possible. He is actually testing to see if this is possible, let alone rewarding. He does a great job of bringing the relative impact of his actions into focus, and this is Kalmus. My 5 most effective actions were quitting planes, vegetarianism, bicycling, veganism, and composting. In this class, we have, of course, talked about cars, planes, and animal products as a problem. But Kalmus not only underscores that these are major issues, he shows how he acted on them and the results. Kalmus also draws attention to seemingly little things that, might escape our attention. For example, quoting him, when we first moved into our house in 2008, there were 5 pilot lights emitting a whopping 1,600 kilograms of CO2 or equivalent gases per year. This translates into 3,527 pounds, or over 1.5 metric tons. Recall that we should each annually be emitting no more than 2 metric tons. I'm curious which reductions in particular the Kalmus and his family made that you found interesting or surprising. For example, he notes that by switching to using a clothesline, they reduced their household CO2 emissions by 550 kilograms. This one little change saves them 0.5 metric ton of CO2 or equivalent gases annually. Note that there's an incredibly small amount of CO2 embedded in a clothesline, especially when compared to the manufacturer of a clothes dryer. But because he's a climate scientist, Kalmus really likes to back up what he says with cold, hard facts. For example, he notes that, quote, the average American diet emits 2,900 kilos of CO2 per year, which is almost 3 metric tons, and hence can completely blow your individual carbon allotment. Another eye-opening statistic is that each dollar spent on new stuff represents roughly 0.5 kilograms of embedded CO2 emissions. And that's counting manufacturing, packaging, and shipping. As the average U.S. person spends a little over $6,000 per year on new stuff, average CO2 emissions are something like 3,000 kilograms of CO2, which translates into 3 metric tons per American. And hence, you can completely blow your individual climate budget that way, too. Kalmus also notes that U.S. landfills emit 1,300 kilograms, and that's 1.3 metric tons. of CO2 per person per year. So let that sink in for a moment. Our society in the U.S. has reached a point where every person's trash taken by itself generates more CO2 than the average person in Bangladesh generates for everything. While you might expect Kalmus to focus solely on personal action, his chapter on collection action reveals that he has a more holistic view of the situation. For example, he succinctly notes that, quote, global warming is a market failure. Burning fossil fuels imposes huge costs on society that aren't included in the price of the fuels, primarily by causing global warming and respiratory illness. It's crucial to fix this market failure because few of us will voluntarily stop burning fossil fuels in a society that still strongly rewards this behavior. Close quote. As Kalmus notes, he takes up the question of activism in order to, quote, balance his focus on personal change. And this is Kalmus. In this chapter, I presented my opinions as a human, not as a scientist. Although my job is to do science, as a human, I have as much right to respectfully express my opinions as anyone else. I've done so here in order to balance my emphasis on individual action and emission reductions in the book. In other words, since the book and the documentary Being the Change focus on lifestyle changes, we might assume that this is the sole contribution that Peter Kalmus is making. However, if he had stopped at lifestyle changes, we would have never known about his actions. Consequently, he wrote the book and commissioned the documentary in order to spread the word. In this sense, Peter Kalmus's principal form of activism is not personal action, but communication. Indeed, just one of nearly 8 billion people on Earth, his lifestyle changes are virtually insignificant. However, as his book and documentary have reached many thousands of people, they are the far more significant change. I'm interested to hear what you make of both Peter Kalmus's approach to the climate crisis through personal action, as well as his understanding of activism. So as normal, this class discussion if you're reading it, will be in italics, and I haven't paraphrased anything, though I do correct the occasional typo, things I've said all along. So, and what I would do here is first quote an observation by a student, followed by my thoughts. Okay, first observation, and this is from a student. When Peter Kalmus admitted that one person's reduction of greenhouse gas emissions may feel like a small drop of change in a vast sea, I didn't really then understand why it was so important for him to make these personal changes. Some people may ask, why make an effort when it won't make a difference? It's a crucial question. But I found that Kalmus explained it perfectly. One, he finds joy in a deeper connection with people and the environment when producing less greenhouse gas emissions. Two, it aligns with his personal principles. Third, and finally, he believes this really does help indirectly. I think Kalmus is right. Showing others how much you care for the environment will probably inspire them to change. Reading Kalmus's experiences makes a sustainable lifestyle seem approachable and rewarding. He states that he spends $4,000 per year on goods, and even on the stuff he buys at Target, which is something I can relate to. He shows us that we can still buy the things we need and live sustainably. I also loved how Kalmus mentioned that his main food source comes from trading surpluses, veganism, and growing his own food. As Kalmus states, a lot of the emissions of food comes from growing, processing, packaging, and distributing it. So I would love to expand my small garden one day to produce a lot of my own food. End of the comment, and great comment. This comment really gets to the heart of being the change, as well as the question of what each of us can do to help mitigate the climate crisis. In fact, being the change highlights all the sort of personal actions, from going vegan to drying your clothes on a line, yet makes clear that these personal actions are just, as this comment notes, like a small drop of change in a vast sea. Why then go to the trouble of doing them? As this person succinctly expresses this quandary, I'm quoting the person here, why make an effort when it won't make a difference? End quote. As this person rightly notes, Kalmus has a variety of answers, but he makes a shocking statement in Chapter 1, and this is Kalmus. I reduced my personal CO2 emissions from about 20 tons per year, near the U.S. average, under 2 tons per year. As amazing an achievement as this is, it's not the shocking part. After all, we can all imagine making all sorts of sacrifices that would dramatically reduce our personal greenhouse gas emissions. But here's the truly shocking part. Kalmus adds, and I quote here, overall, this hasn't been a sacrifice. It has made me happier, close quote. As the person who made this comment unfolds the idea, he finds joy and a deeper connection with people and the environment when producing less greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, even without the tremendous gains for the Earth, its climate, and all its life, the changes that Kalmus made to his life would be worth it, as these, in fact, in his mind, were not sacrificed, but rather led to greater happiness. This runs completely counter to the belief that many people have, even if they, haven't given it much thought. Namely, that the personal changes that we, and by that I mean people in wealthy countries like the U.S., the changes we need to make to address the climate crisis will, in fact, to most people seem to be profound sacrifices. This is yet another example, and may in fact be the central example in a certain sense, of how personal action and cultural changes addressing the climate crisis can be a win-win, as these changes will not result in inferior lives for us all, but better, happier lives. We've already seen this with issues like educating women and girls and giving them access to family planning. Clearly, this is a win-win, as it benefits girls and women as well as the planet. Peter Kalmus is at once generalizing this basic notion, even as he's making it deeply personal. The climate crisis is an opportunity to do just what Henry David Thoreau prodded us all to do. Radically rethink our lives with the hope of making them more meaningful and simply better. Peter Kalmus and his family took up this challenge and did just that. In the process, Kalmus and his family provide an example for the rest of us, which hints at the potential for systemic change rather than just personal transformation. This not only includes wealthy countries like the U.S., as this is a new version of the American dream that could potentially be exported across the planet. So the next comment. Peter Kalmus, in Being the Change, attempts to uncover the importance of individual action. Peter Kalmus decided to change his lifestyle for the sake of his children. He wanted a better world for them. Climate change is affecting all life on the planet. Kalmus wants his children to experience life on Earth without the worry of an end. Kalmus has a philosophy he follows which involves his head, hands, and heart. The head is for realizing from an intellectual, scientific point of view that there is a problem. Once the problem is recognized, we can take action with our hands. The hands are used for things like gardening, fixing old objects, riding a bike, and much more. The heart ties the head and the hands together. The heart is where meaning is found in making life more satisfying. In conclusion, taking part in environmentally friendly things equals a happier, more meaningful life. Close quote. And another really perceptive comment. Regarding the previous comment, this is a nice way of framing the issue, as Kalmus does indeed seem to be attempting to, quote, uncover the importance of individual action with respect to the climate crisis. This comment also makes clear that Kalmus is looking beyond his own life to the future. If you recall, I have a small lecture series on climate and generation in which I argue that one of the fundamental challenges with the climate crisis is that it requires us to think beyond a single generation, i.e. beyond our individual lives. To Peter Kalmus, indeed to parents everywhere, children provide an opportunity and an impetus to do just that. This comment also introduces the threefold approach to the climate crisis used by Kalmus: head, hands, and heart. As he explains, and this is Peter Kalmus. One is an intellectual understanding, the head. The head allows me to prioritize. It helps me navigate to my goals, although I find it not always good at choosing these goals. One of the lessons I've learned is that I'm limited in time, energy, and ability. If I'm to make any progress, I need to choose my path wisely. This means asking the right questions, gathering information about reality as it is, which is often different than how it appears to be or how I want it to be, and drawing conclusions objectively. The head is a scientist. Close quote. Kalmus continues by noting that the second part, and this is his quote, part of my path is practical action, the hands. As we shall see, society's business-as-usual trajectory is carrying us toward disaster. If we wish to avoid disaster, we must take action. Since I cannot change the entire global trajectory single-handedly, I perform practical and local actions, changing myself and how I live right here and right now. Direct personal action is empowering. It brings measurable, tangible change. It's fun, and therefore I can sustain it easily. It provides its own guidance. Time and time again, I have found that only by taking a step, making some actual change, is the next step revealed. I find that all the planning and intellectualizing in the world can substitute for just doing something. There is wisdom in doing. Close quote. And finally, he notes that a, quote, third part of my path is seeing from the heart. The third part is what connects me to myself, to other people, and to nature. Without it, action can become compulsive and joyless. Connection brings purpose and meaning to thought and action. I have a specific and concrete practice for this third part. I meditate by observing my body and mind in a particular way. Meditation allows me to be joyful most of the time, even while studying global warming every day at work. Meditation helps me connect to the sea of everyday practices around me. The plants growing, the sun shining, my older son loving putting his arm around his brother's shoulder. I find great strength in this awareness, close quote. So bringing it all together, Kalmus argues that, quote, these three parts support and balance one another. In shaping a response to our predicament, each part is important. Close quote. So I'm going to go to the next comment. I want to focus on one particular subject you have mentioned, which is Peter Kalmus's proposal of a carbon tax. Personally, I believe it's a great measure, but by no means perfect. For example, people may still choose to buy the taxed product if the corporations advertise them as being necessary to people, and to cut the costs by imposed by the taxes. Corporations might choose to cut costs in other ways, such as by choosing cheaper labor and resources, which is usually not a good thing. It's obvious that for the carbon fee to work most efficiently, corporation behavior needs to be strictly regulated, and the public needs to be more clearly informed about the environmental cost of each product or service. But even if the carbon fee plan has problems, it's still the best plan for now. As Kalmus has said in his book, he is walking the middle path, and a carbon fee would only be the first step. It has proved to be effective in small scales, such as the example of British Columbia mentioned in the book. But clearly, to impose it on a larger scale, on the entire United States, there is still more work to be done, from the individual level way up to government. So, close quote. Another really apt comment. At the risk of stating the obvious, one of the difficulties with voluntary action is that many people will simply not opt in. You may, for example, find the idea of slow travel intriguing and appealing. However, many, maybe most people, will simply find the whole idea ludicrous. How then can we convince them to swear off something like air travel? This is where a carbon fee comes into play. So, as I noted on my lecture on air travel, on a personal level, there's simply no way to emit more greenhouse gases more quickly than by air travel. While this is enormously disturbing, a carbon fee is tailor-made to address this problem. A carbon fee would mean that we would pay for each and every pound of CO2 or equivalent gases that we emit into the atmosphere. As a round-trip transcontinental air trip causes significantly more than a metric ton of emissions to be released for each passenger, the cost of each and every plane ticket would rise significantly with just a small carbon fee. If the fee were increased to adequately reflect the climate change, the climate damage done by air travel, the cost of each ticket would skyrocket. Consequently, even people who would never voluntarily fly less would nonetheless be flying less, probably a lot less. It would also mean that they would be looking for less expensive alternatives to air travel. Because electric buses and high-speed rail can be powered by renewable energy, the cost of these would not rise with the carbon fee, because presumably a carbon fee wouldn't significantly impact them. Hence, generally speaking, a carbon fee would cause everyone, and this is not just climate activists, to gravitate to climate-friendly options, regardless of whether it involves air travel, housing, food, clothing, whatever. However, as this comment rightly notes, and there will no doubt be all sorts of challenges to implementing a carbon tax, there will no doubt be lots of challenges, not the least of which being electing officials willing to write the legislation that would put them in place. The next comment. A similarity I saw between Ken's lectures and from this chapter is reducing flying because of its huge impact. In addition, Kalmus provides good reasons of why he prefers slow travel that I think are underappreciated in our lifestyles today. He says slow travel allows him to connect with the local communities more than and have more of an adventure. Well, he also notes that flying can spread disease in a pandemic like we have witnessed with the coronavirus, COVID-19. End of the quote. So in my short lecture on flying, I introduced the idea of slow travel. If you're intrigued by the idea, Peter Kalmus has a whole chapter on the subject of it in his book, Being the Change, which he opens with a wonderful little quote by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And this is, "The miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is to walk on the green earth." Close quote. In other words, slowly walking through a place rather than flying at 3/4 the speed of sound over it, 8 miles up in the air, we have the opportunity to see just how wonderful and miraculous the earth really is. Kalmus's chapter on slow travel, which, like the rest of the book, you can read free online, is an interesting one and a fun read. For example, he recounts how he hitched a ride on a cargo ship from the port of Los Angeles to Honolulu. After talking to the chief engineer on the ship, Kalmus was able to run the numbers, comparing his trip to what it would have been if he had flown. He realized that, and this is Kalmus, quote, "My emissions for the trip were 0.003 kilogram per CO2 emissions per mile, 1% of the emissions had I flown." As this comment notes, in his chapter on leaving fossil fuels, Kalmus makes a remarkable prescient statement in 2017. This is Kalmus. "Modern air travel is the ideal way for a local outbreak to spread into a pandemic." During COVID-19, during the pandemic, when new variants like Delta and Omicron were spreading, we became used to hearing statements like, "The variant is now in blank because a traveler had come there from blank." This was almost always someone who had traveled there by air, by plane. Next comment. While I was reading the chapters from Being the Change, I read something so pertinent that I stopped reading and put it in my journal. Kalmus writes, quote, "If you choose flying, go forth and fly, but please don't pretend your life is sustainable." End of the quote. Ever since learning about the extreme climate impacts of air travel, it's felt like forbidden information. If I didn't know how much greenhouse gas emissions I was directly responsible for when I traveled via plane, then I wouldn't feel so incredibly guilty about it. One of my number one goals in life is to travel. In my dream and life, I'd never be sedentary. I'd be constantly nomadic, jetting from one new place to another. Kalmus highlights the importance of personal action, and for my entire adult life, I've agreed and tried to live as sustainably as I can. But then he really punches me in the gut. He tells me that if I fly, then I can't consider my life sustainable environmentally. And he's right. And Ken is right. And flying frequently isn't a goal I should aspire to. Maybe it's time to rethink my life goals. Maybe, instead of visiting a new far-off place every month, my dream life consists of living smack dab in the middle of every continent for 5 years at a time. Then I can only take a plane once every 5 years and can just train everywhere. That sounds really cool. This is a major theme I take away from the reading. In the future, I can make choices that challenge cultural aspirations, but still lead to a fulfilling life, perhaps even more than the status quo. I want to live like Kalmus. He seems happier than most, and he is actually making a difference in the world. I don't want to become someone that says they care about the planet, but then knowingly take selfish actions that harm it. I want to be the change. End of the quote. Wow, what a great comment. And time for a confession on my part. Although I have not flown for a number of years now, and I am more than a little critical of professors who rack up air miles in order to attend academic conferences, I am, wait for it, actually looking forward to getting on a plane in a few years. Why? Well, as I never tire of mentioning, I have a young daughter. I also have a sabbatical year coming up, which allows me to spend a year doing research, including doing it abroad. So when my daughter is a little older, perhaps 11 or 12, the plan is that my partner, daughter, and I will fly to England and then travel around Europe and Asia and perhaps even Africa for a year via mass transit, which is generally far superior to what we have in the U.S. I think this would be a great experience for my daughter. Of course, we intend to stay in specific places for a while. Every now and then, I dream about the details. For example, while it's possible to fly directly from LAX and Los Angeles to Heathrow Airport in London, this involves traveling over 5,400 miles. Alternately, taking a more efficient approach to transportation, it's possible to take a train across the U.S. and then fly from JFK Airport in New York to London, which cuts the air miles down to 3,400. But this too can be bested because we could travel up to Canada and fly from St. John's, Newfoundland to Heathrow via Air Canada, which would cut air travel leg of this trip down to 2,300 miles. Far from inconvenience, I suspect that traveling across the U.S. and perhaps Canada would actually be a wonderful way to start the trip. Even today, decades later, I still fondly remember when I traveled across the U.S. by way of train, which coincidentally was when I was 12 years old. My point in mentioning all this is that living sustainably does not mean that we have to completely cut out even something as environmentally disastrous as air travel from our lives. Of course, it would be terrific if our country committed itself to crisscrossing the U.S. with high-speed transit powered by renewable energy, and if we developed efficient ways to take a ship from North America to Europe. But in the meantime, it is actually possible to reduce our climate footprint from air travel by a factor of 10 or more. And it's embarrassingly easy to do so. Just fly 1/10 as much. If my daughter were to take a year-long trip like this every 11 or 12 years, perhaps by taking a gap year after college for her next one, on average, 1 month out of every year of her life would be spent traveling. Yet her air travel would be just 1/12, around 8% of what it would have been if she made a similar trip by air every year, all things being equal. As the person who made this comment aptly notes, quote, maybe it's time to rethink my life goals. Maybe instead of visiting a new far-off place every month, my dream consists of living smack dab in the middle of every continent for 5 years at a time. Then I can only take a plane once every 5 years and can just train everywhere. That sounds really cool. Yeah, it does indeed sound really cool. In fact, as opposed to those silly, 5 countries in 5 days vacations, this would be a far better way to truly experience a place and to get to know its people, its animals, plants, history, geography, and so forth. In a general way, this returns to our perhaps surprising message that Peter Kalmus has for us. While living sustainably may initially seem like we will be requiring us to do without things like travel. In fact, if we are thoughtful and creative, we can not only still enhance our lives and experience things like travel, we can make such an experience happier and more rewarding. So the next quote. This reading and the film shows how everyday people can change their habits and practices in order to help the planet. I thought it was interesting to see how to calculate my footprint, although I'm terrible at math and I've not been keeping track of how many miles I drive, how many times my family does laundry in a month, etc. Now, websites that show your carbon footprint are really helpful in that regard. Okay, at the risk of being a spoiler, the assignment for week 10 of English 24 will indeed be to use a website to calculate your individual carbon footprint. So stay tuned for that.